hello. How are you?
Good afternoon. I'm doing well.
I am so pleased. I'm Commissioner Carolyn Rice, and I'm so pleased to have Jessica Jenkins on us. Can you tell us a little bit about your group, the Human Services and Planning Division?
Sure. Yes, I'm Jessica Jenkins, as you mentioned, but the director of the county's Human Services Planning and Development Department. And so our department really is unique in a number of ways, but we have the privilege of really being a department that's focused on coordination and collaboration with various stakeholder groups around the human services needs for our county. And so we, as a department, support our Family and Children's First Council, our Human Service Levy Council, and our Homeless Solutions Policy Board, which I know you're familiar with because you're one of our esteemed members of that policy board. But again, our charge is really looking at the community's human services needs, working through allocation recommendations, coordination, service planning, and a whole host of things kind of under that umbrella.
Absolutely. And actually, that's why I invited you to come in today.
Yeah.
I thought we would spend our time really focusing in on the homeless solutions and that whole issue of homelessness here in Montgomery County.
Yeah.
So, what are the common misconceptions about homelessness that you've encountered in this community? Let's just start off with the things that people get wrong about homelessness.
Yeah, and there are a few that come to mind. I think some of the misconceptions really are that people make this choice to go without housing, that there's really a lot of self-choice around, I don't want to do this. And I have been fortunate to be in this field for almost 20 years, almost 2 decades. And so I work with a number of service providers. I've worked even in the nonprofit space. And I've talked to people that, do a lot of the day-to-day work with people that are experiencing homelessness. And I'll never forget talking to one of the street outreach workers who said, in my career of doing this work, I've never had someone that really truly chose that if they had the right alternative, the right option, wouldn't accept it. A lot of times, people are making decisions out of a lot of factors. And so it is that if the right opportunity, the right timing, there is a yes there. And so again, our goal is to try to make that the case. But again, there's lots of things that go into why a person may be unsheltered, and to have that kind of simple, well, they're just choosing that choice, is often a lot more layered.
It's always more complicated.
Always more complicated. The other thing is similar around that. People often think they should just get a job. And I think that people don't recognize how many people that are in our shelters or even sleeping in cars unsheltered that really do work every day, work more in some cases than 40 hours, and still can't afford their housing. So I think that misperception around employment and homelessness, there really are a lot of people that are trying to make ends meet, and the ends just don't even come close together because there's such disparities in wages and housing costs and food costs, and it runs the gamut. So just reminding folks that it's, again, often way more complex than that simple, oh, just do this, or you just made this decision. There's so much complexity.
Right. And kind of on that point, I know recently that the Homeless Solutions Policy Board released data and statistics on the number of people who are experiencing homelessness in Montgomery County. I know we have you're going to probably talk about it, the point in time count, but what can you share about the numbers and trends regarding homelessness in this community?
Absolutely. So annually we do share with our community, because really the community stakeholders are how we do our work. And so it's important that we report out our progress in our places of challenge. And so the way we quantify homelessness in our community is kind of done in 2 primary ways. We look at homelessness over the course of a year. We traditionally locally talk about it in a calendar year. And then we also do a 1-day snapshot. It's called the point in time count. You'll hear that even in national media, they talk about that, because across the country, communities are doing that single night count. And it's really a way for the federal government, for us to talk about the scale of homelessness in our community. So in the 2024 annual statistics, again, that's looking at homelessness over the course of an entire year,
January through
December, we measure people that have spent at least one night at our emergency shelters, and those are the St. Vincent de Paul Shelter for Women and Families, our Gettysburg Gateway for Men, the Daybreak Youth Shelter, the YWCA Domestic Violence Shelter, and then any individual that has contact with our MVHO or Miami Valley Housing Opportunities, PATH, Street Outreach, all make up that number of, in a given year, how many people experience homelessness. Last year, it was 3,990 households.
Wow.
That's about 4,501 people people that are a part of those households. And so that number is a slight decrease from the immediate year prior, from 2023, which is a good step, but still that number
but not
is
where it needs to be.
a lot higher than it was, back to pre-pandemic numbers. And so we really are focused now, since we have not seen the sharp decreases we were hoping to see and maintain during the pandemic, that we've got to kind of reimagine how we approach our work to end homelessness. And then on a single night, so again, it's the fourth Tuesday night in January for us here in Ohio, different places, different days in the country.
But all in January.
But all in January, and for us, again, that fourth Tuesday night of that month, we look at and we send teams out overnight, wee hours of the morning. They're going out to places before people get up and moving. So under train trestles, parking lots, 24-hour gyms, places like that, to do an unsheltered count of people that are sleeping unsheltered. And then we also work with our shelters to get data from them on who spent the night in those shelters on that night. And so this year's point in time count number was 639 people. And so that's all those places I just mentioned. Of those 639 people, 83%, so about 428 of them, were in one of our shelters. So they had, a safe, warm place to be, still experiencing homelessness, but were, under a roof, right? It was cold that night, so they had, access to the things they needed to stay warm and safe. Contrastly, there were 111 people, that's about 17%, that were unsheltered. So in some way, they were, on a park bench, they were on the streets in an abandoned home, in their car, and again, in that cold January temperatures. And so, unfortunately, that number this year marked for us a record high. We had seen a record previously in 2023 of 107. And then went down just a little bit in 24, and unfortunately find ourselves this year with a record of that 111 people that experienced homelessness unsheltered this year. So we're really leaning into that number to better understand. We've got to why and do we have adequate supports for that population in specific? Being unsheltered, often a little bit more transient, catching up with them to make sure we're connecting with them around our assessment processes and housing resources. It gets a little bit more tricky when they're kind of on the move, because often they're trying to stay under the radar, evade law enforcement and other parties, as they're navigating their housing crisis. And so we're really trying to make sure that we are leaning in on understanding, again, the why and the how do we resolve this for you? How do we make sure that, our goal as a system is around homelessness being rare, brief, and one time, and that really is across the board. But each scenario has slightly different nuance, and so we have to work collectively.
Once again, it's complicated.
It is complicated, but we're the folks that can do it together to solve it. I mean, I think you're so right about it, the complicated need of it or nuance of it. But I will say, as a community, we are so uniquely positioned, and I'm sure we'll talk more, but it really is that an opportunity. We're kind of that Cinderella, or is it Goldilocks, one of those fairy tales, right, where you're just able to kind of get the right folks, the right energy, the right climate to get things done.
Well, and the dedication to it.
Absolutely.
Never going to give up.
Yep.
So how do we compare to other communities here in Ohio? Let's just talk about Ohio.
Yeah, so here in Ohio, I will say, we compare ourselves to kind of similarly mid-sized communities, and those are Akron and Toledo. And unfortunately, we lead the pack in numbers, and we measure our point-in-time count numbers against theirs, and we're at the top in terms of the number of households that are experiencing homelessness in our community. So again, that means work to be done, sleeves to roll up, and really have the conversations around what is missing from our kind of continuum of solutions and resolutions for folks to really make sure that we have the right match for the folks that are having this housing crisis. Now, I will say, to the same end, we are lower than our major Cs, right? The big Cs, which are, larger metros, but that we aren't, quite in that same ballpark yet. But, when you think about it, I think proportionally, we're kind of all hovering at that same level, which means there's also opportunity across the state to have that collective conversation. We do meet with our peer continuums of care on a semi-regular basis to also kind of say, are you seeing some of these same trends? What are some of the solutions that you're approaching to really make sure that we are where we can, learning from each other and taking those steps to really be looking at this issue holistically where we can in the work. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
And and I've read a lot. We're just talking mainly about Ohio is where we compare ourselves, but this is not unique to Ohio.
Absolutely not. Yes,
in fact,
across
it
the
can
country.
even be greater in some
And
areas.
it really is. I mean, I do say at the presentation we did a few weeks ago, that was one of the kind of, talking points. While we are not trending how we want to and know that we have work to do, we have not seen the same level of increases as other communities on the West Coast, East Coast. We really have, again, seen
which
that
is a positive.
Which is a positive in terms of the scale of that. Some communities have seen rapid increases. And so we're, again, in that position that we have enough that we can get our arms around it, hopefully, and come up with those correct solutions to really move us forward.
So, you've mentioned it, and maybe we can dig a little deeper. What do you think are really the primary drivers? And you've already mentioned it, but homelessness here in Montgomery County, economic, social, systemic. Is there anything particular that you want to talk about that to help to explain to those who are unfamiliar with this issue?
I love to say all of the above, right? It's one of those types of questions, and that each of those has a factor in what I think really is underlying the housing instability that people in our community are facing.
Sure.
I have to say economically, the disparity in wages and housing increases really have, impacted a lot of households, right? Not being able to meet the rising cost of rent. We've seen exponential growth in the fair market rent, even for a one-bedroom unit. And so that really puts a strain when folks have these increased and kind of feel like they have no other choice but to, pay. There is also a high occupancy rate. So there's not a lot of vacant units either. Right. So you got a lot of units that are full. Your landlord says, hey, your rent's going up $100.
Well, and I've heard about incredibly long waiting lists.
Oh, absolutely.
Months from now.
And I think I've heard you mention this stat, Commissioner Rice, especially among the extremely low income renters, there is 40 units for every 100 people. So there's a gap. And so economically, part of that gap is driven because people don't have the income to afford the housing. And so that's one of the pieces for sure. And then everything's rising, right? So it's gas in the car, it's food in the groceries, and it's the rent. And it's like, how do you make all these work? Especially because
you don't,
because wages have not kept pace with those other rising increases. So from a economic standpoint, those are some of the key factors. The lack of affordable housing, the lack of wages keeping pace with those increased costs. I would say socially, though, we all kind of endured through, or many of us fortunately endured through the pandemic, but that also led to a lot of social isolation. And so that too, as people lose some of their social connections, and that also is a destabilizing factor. And so the person you may have gone to before to either sleep on their couch or borrow $100 to cover their rent for a few months doesn't exist in the same way, because you've kind of found yourself in a place of more isolation. And then certainly the mental health.
Which continues to ripple out, not just with homelessness, but mental health issues. It's all complicated and connected. Now, are there any particular populations, such as youth or veterans or families, who are disproportionately affected?
There are. And so we have, as a community, looked and leaned into a few of those populations. We've known for really, frankly, a long time that people of color disproportionately experience homelessness. And when we've looked at the data in our system, often it's about 50-50 African-American households and white households, but our county population is not that, right? So we know then there's an overrepresentation of those households of color that are showing up and experiencing homelessness. That's for a variety of reasons, systemic, like racism and redlining, that really have created that disparity in wealth and economics, as well as access to housing. And then in addition to that, I would say other populations that have been overrepresented are young people that have had experience in our foster care system. That vulnerability early on in their life is unfortunately often a predictor of homelessness later in their lives.
So sad.
And so really trying to work with youth that are experiencing homelessness to kind of early on adopt the right approaches and supports to help, again, the experience is rare, brief, and one time. And then I would also say people that identify as LGBTQ+, also, again, overrepresented in the population for a number of reasons. Sometimes that social component, they are earlier forced out of their homes, or having to kind of navigate life on their own earlier and sooner, especially among our young people. And we see that, again, we need to have tailored responses to make sure people feel supported and in community as they transition from homelessness back to housing and stability.
Right. Yeah. So we've kind of set the stage of the populations that are the reasons behind it. So when it comes to policy and services, what role does local government what do we do? What is our role, and
right.
where are the gaps, and how do we fill those gaps?
Absolutely. It's an excellent question. And so I liked how you framed it in that too. We are one partner, one leader among many. This is a complex issue, as we've talked about, that really requires an all hands on deck approach, but certainly government often is looked to as a key stakeholder in that work. It was local government that almost 2 decades ago put together the Homeless Solutions Policy Board. It was Montgomery County's leadership, the City of Dayton's leadership, and United Way, our nonprofit partner, that really came together to say we need a different strategy for how we approach homelessness in Montgomery County.
Right.
And so local government, came to that table being a convener, also being a leader in resource allocation around how we invest in strategies that are evidence-based, that really help propel the work forward. So I think of kind of government's role, especially as being that convener, but also the glue in some ways. But again, you've got to have other pieces to be, kind of melding together to have that comprehensive response. It takes that village. But for us specifically, Montgomery County serves as our continuum of care. So our role is really to be that umbrella, convener, authority to some regard, of oversight around organizer around kind of what the system response is. But again, as a part of that, it really requires that we have people with lived experience, we have our nonprofit partners, we have, again, so many other stakeholders that have an interest really in seeing our community into homelessness.
Well, having attended the board meetings now for 7 years, it's a room full. It's a large room. I'd say there's 50 people in that room, and that's not everybody there.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it truly is, and yet there's still so much more we need to do.
Yeah, there is. But again, I think government, because we do, and we have a unique position in government to, be able to tap into resources specific to government around human services needs. And so homelessness is one of those things. And so locally, our county supports our homeless shelters and housing programs through our human service levy to a degree. That then allows us to leverage another $14 million in state and federal grants to really have a system
kind of
approach.
Once you identify, you talked about assessing and kind of understanding what is happening with this specific case, this person, this family.
Their needs, absolutely.
And then making sure, to the extent we can, if I understand sitting there all these years, is that we try to match up the wraparound services that'll help get them on, because people want to be in homes.
They do. That's exactly it. I mean, I went back to that misperception around people thinking people don't want that stability. People do. And again, it's just putting together what their needs and what the supports they need look like. And again, it's often, for every person you talk to, their experience to how they got into a housing crisis is going to be different. The response might be equally as different based on their needs and their unique circumstances. So we just have to work through that.
So is there any particular program or innovative solution here that you'd want to just kind of highlight for our listeners?
Yeah, so there's a few things that we've been kind of engaged in or exploring that really are exciting. The first one would be around our youth homelessness efforts. So we were fortunate to be selected in 2021 we were one of, I think, 30-some communities selected in the round 4 and 5 of the Youth Homelessness Demonstration Program from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, which really gave us an opportunity to lean into data and direct feedback from our young people around the solutions they needed to end their housing instability and homelessness. And so it allowed us to develop 3 new projects that were specifically targeted and tailored to our young people, with their voice involved in the design of those programs and the implementation. And so really proud of that ability to have, brought young people together. We have a youth action board that helps support that work and really is a part of the governing model. And then providers, Daybreak and Homeful, that have kind of risen to that occasion of really leaning into how they design and develop resources that are with our youth voices in mind. And so they're still earlier in implementation, but I think just the energy around how do we take the information from a certain population.
Well, kind of getting it early.
Yeah.
So this doesn't be,
that's true too, yeah.
To hopefully get them back on track to a more productive future.
So that, again, it's rare breathing. It's a one-time, absolutely, 100%. It's part of the goal of that earlier intervention with our young adult homelessness efforts. And the other space, I'd say, that's something that I'm really excited about, our steps into it more deeply, around shelter diversion and kind of the prevention space, right? Often we focus on the interventions, right? We have shelter beds, we have an outreach team through our continuum. But there's also opportunity to work to engage people right before they come into the system. It frankly often is a more cost-effective method to keep someone in their housing than to then have them engage in shelter and have to rehouse them. And so really
and they lose so much.
That is also both socially, physically, all those ways. There is a loss in that process. You're absolutely right. And so thinking about how we're able to intervene and engage with folks and do a lot of housing problem solving earlier, I think, is a space that we're really trying to better address, so that, again, our number doesn't continue to creep up, right? Our stats can start to trend downward. And I think really a lot of that investment right before people come in that front door, as we call it, into the homeless system will bear a lot of fruit if we're able to really resolve folks' crisis there before. Because, again, it just gets a lot more challenging once you have kind of lost so many things, whether it's social connections, financial resources.
The hole is just deeper.
Yeah, the work to repair just takes a little bit longer.
Right, yeah. For sure. So, I mentioned mental health. So how can we better integrate like mental health and, substance abuse issues? I know quite a few years ago we were, on the headlines of the time with just all of the opioid issues, which is, like COVID, has continued to have ripple effects throughout the community. Where's that space? What are you encouraged by that's happening right now or needs to happen?
Yeah, probably a little bit of both, but I will say, again, proud that our community is in that sweet spot of having really active leaders in the space around mental health and substance use. We collaborate in intentional ways with our Adamus board because they really are responsible for having oversight of our mental health and substance use system. And so we have a lot of kind of shared connection around providers, around making sure that when people are in housing, they have connections to those mental health resources, and really trying to ensure that there is that continuum that is really, frankly, oftentimes shared across their system and our housing and homeless system. I know there's been work, obviously, in the recent years around the behavioral health kind of task force, a behavioral health portal that will also include kind of how we think about housing and folks that are at risk of housing instability. And so there is that kind of duality of being able to, again, make sure that we are building out a continuum around the person versus having the person navigate these systems. How do we talk and work better in coordination so that folks don't get lost in that shuffle? So I really am encouraged by the collaboration that I've seen with our system and the mental health and substance use providers and the broader Adamus system, as we really don't see ourselves as separate, but really integrated in a lot of ways around how we serve shared populations and continue to innovate around that. I'd also say, we have, when our work began, again, 2 decades ago, really invested in a supportive housing model, which means that people really, while housing is the answer to homelessness, connection to the supports they need is also paramount. Giving people access to that mental health and substance use treatment really has to be a conversation that we're having for people that are in our housing programs, again, to make sure that things are that brief in one time. We need to have those connections if people want them to those support services. So really making sure that...
So when they get the opportunity, they're going to be able to take full advantage of it, rather than kind of have other issues and then it falls through.
And getting stuck. And so I think if you asked about gaps, I think it's just making sure that we're able to scale and resource those services, right? Because we know that sometimes there are delays and wait lists and, and timing for people to get in. So making sure that we really are, again, I think the portal will be helpful too in being able to kind of help people navigate as they need to.
And it's kind of projected for next year to be available. So while it seems too far away,
it's coming soon.
It's coming. It is coming.
It really is.
So what can anyone listening, what could they do to be part of it if they're called to this? How could they help?
I love the question. So there's so many ways, from the big to the small. I think I often start with folks that when I get that question, it's just a recognition, right? When you see someone that may be down on their luck or having a hard time, just that, acknowledgement that they're there, whether it's a word of affirmation, word of encouragement sometimes goes a long way, but just them being seen. So often people that experience homelessness kind of are among the hidden shadows
feel
of
like
our community.
invisible.
And so just the acknowledgement, I think often it's just about we're in community together. Our well-being is connected, right? So I think sometimes that's just a simple thing people can do. But certainly in a time such as this, I encourage folks to think about supporting our nonprofits that are delivering the direct services. And that support looks everything like, a contribution of resources, financial, or donations of goods, but then also time and talent, volunteering, offering skills to help them, do the work. It really is difficult work, and we definitely don't do it without those providers that are really boots on the ground, working on this challenging issue every day. And so I just always encourage people have the capacity, have the opportunity to really look for that organization, look for that cause that warms your heart and gets you engaged in being able to serve in some way. And nothing's too small. I often people think they've got to have a great big checkbook. Sometimes it's just a couple hours volunteering or delivering donuts and coffee to the staff. That really makes a big difference. And again, we're in this community together. This challenge is going to require all of us to be a part of the solution, and those little touches often really go a long way.
And, like you said, whatever it calls to you, if everybody just did even one small little something, what a difference that would make.
I'd be remiss if I also didn't say advocacy. Certainly there's a lot of things that are being proposed at the state and federal level, and so we also want people to pay attention. Can't decide for them, but where there's opportunities to advocate for increases to affordable housing, resources to address homelessness, we definitely welcome those voices alongside ours and really supporting those dollars being there for us.
Well, as we wrap up, I'm going to give you, if you could just be, twinkle your nose and have one wish come true, and it would happen tomorrow, what would that be, other than just solve the whole thing?
I know. So in thinking about that question, what came to mind, I was recently at a conference and the person mentioned everyone should have a thriving wage. It's not necessarily a living wage or just a housing wage, but a thriving wage, so people could be their best self. So if I could just wave a magic wand, I would have a world in which people had access to that thriving wage that made them be able to be their best self. And, that to me means everyone that's homeless gets to be housed, right? Because it gives them the access to that housing that's affordable for them.
Well, I think that is a wonderful way for us to end up our conversation on a high note. Yeah. I like that idea. I hope that wish comes true someday.
Me too.
But it has been a pleasure to have you with me here today. And as Jessica has said, if any of you are called to this, there's something you can do. Just even call into my office and we'll point you in the right direction. But thank you for all the work that you do. It is such an honor for me to serve on the Homeless Solutions Policy Board. And I salute all the people who, many have devoted their whole lives to helping others in this way. So thank you for being here this afternoon.
We're grateful to have you, but thank you so much for the invitation.
All right.
Take care, everybody.
All right. Thank you.